They found the locket buried beneath a collapsed beam in the ruins of the old plantation house. Blackened wood, sun-blistered metal, and a faint smell of soot still clinging to what had once been the parlor floor. The workers clearing the site paused when they saw it, a small gleam under the ash, half melted yet impossibly intact. One man brushed away the debris and lifted it with 2 fingers, expecting it to crumble. It didn't. The heat had burned the edges, warped the hinge, but the front still showed a carved shape. A woman's eye. One single eye, etched with uncanny detail, the iris almost too human for a simple locket. Inside, wedged at the center, was a coil of hair. Not black, not brown, not even the faded gray of age, but a shock of white, stark, luminous, untouched by smoke or century. The workers whispered that hair shouldn't survive a fire. Metal melts before hair does. Skin becomes ash. But this had endured. And beneath it, pressed against the inner casing, they found something else. A scrap of paper, brittle as winter bark. 3 words written in a hand that trembled even before time had weathered it. Forgive the child. The sheriff's office confiscated the artifact before nightfall. The lead investigator refused to comment, but his deputy leaked enough to start rumors. He said the locket was linked to an old story the county had spent generations trying to bury. The tale of a woman born into slavery with hair white as frost. A woman whose existence defied explanation then, and still does now. Some said she brought sickness. Some whispered she brought visions. Others claimed she brought something far worse. The discovery promised more than an old legend. There were families with influence, names stitched into the fabric of Southern politics, who had paid dearly over the years to ensure the past stayed coffin quiet. That locket threatened to pry the lid open. And what lay beneath wasn't just one life. There were bodies, disappearances, a graveyard with stones too small for adults and too numerous for one household, the kind of secrets that rot a country from the inside. But to understand the story of the white-haired slave woman, known only in old ledgers as Etta, we must step backward into a world forged by heat, hunger, and human cruelty. A world where science stumbled, faith dictated truth, and fear carved itself deep into the bones of every man, woman, and child who walked those fields. Before we continue with the story of Etta and the legacy of what she left behind, join our community of mystery lovers. Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. Your support helps us uncover more forgotten stories like this one. The year was 1832, and the region surrounding the Tallapoosa River lay thick with humidity, cotton dust, and the uneasy silence that often precedes violence. Morning fog clung to the hills like ghost breath, drifting low over the crooked fences and tobacco sheds. The sun rose slowly, as though even it felt weary of shining on a place built from so much pain. Rural Alabama was a land caught between eras, still wild in many ways, but tightening under the grip of wealthy planters whose fortunes swelled with every bale shipped north. Roads were nothing more than rutted paths carved by wagon wheels and livestock. Churches were small wooden boxes with thin steeples, erected by congregations who believed God watched every whisper, every deed, every sin. The courthouse stood at the center of town, tidy and whitewashed, its broad porch lined with benches where older men gathered to read newspapers and trade warnings about politics, storms, and slaves. Women moved through the town square in long cotton dresses, heads bowed against the heat. Their voices were soft, edged with fear of being overheard. Children chased each other through the dust until their mothers snatched them by the arm and murmured that they'd best behave, or they'd bring the overseer's attention. Every corner of life was threaded with cautious glances and the heavy knowledge of the world's unspoken rules. Plantations stretched in every direction, sprawling estates built on cleared forests and broken families. The biggest among them belonged to the Albright family. Their main house rose above the land like a pale sentinel, 3 stories tall with wide verandas and pillars carved from imported wood. Travelers described it as grand, but those who lived within miles of it spoke in quieter tones. They claimed the house breathed at night, groaning under the weight of its history. They said the windows flickered with strange lights long after the lamps should have died. People did not linger on the road near the Albright estate after dark. Inside the slave quarters, the air tasted of old smoke, earth, and boiled cornmeal. The cabins were rough, the roofs patched with tar. At night, when the cicadas hummed and the men had returned from the fields with backs bent, the stories began. They told tales of spirits wandering the woods, of moans rising from the marsh, of the old root worker who lived by the creek and whispered prophecies into the mud. But among themselves, in the privacy of shadows, there was one tale they spoke with a mixture of dread and reverence: the story of the white-haired girl. Some swore she had been born without a sound, pale curls glowing like moonlit threads even as an infant. Others insisted she had screamed for a full hour, a cry so shrill the midwife bled from the nose. The mistress of the Albright house, Etta Albright, refused to nurse her own child for days after witnessing the newborn. "No creature is born like that," she allegedly muttered. "That is a sign from the Lord, and not a good one." Because in 1832, hair that color did not belong to Negro children. It did not belong to anyone in that county, not even the oldest white residents. People searched for explanations: a fever, an illness, a curse, an act of God. Science existed only in books few could read, and the physicians who did practice had limited theories. Many were quick to label anything unfamiliar as an omen. The Albright plantation doctor, a man named Horace Dullen, wrote in his journal that the newborn's hair was an unsettling anomaly. He examined her under lamplight, pinning her tiny arms gently while he inspected her scalp. He later told the master of the plantation that he had seen unusual cases before, but none so striking, none so unnatural. Yet even he hesitated to use the word albinism, for the term was barely understood at the time and carried its own shadows of fear. In the town surrounding the plantation, conversation flowed like ink in the taverns and trading posts. Men resting from wagon journeys leaned on the counters and whispered how the Albrights kept a devil-touched child in their quarters. "A white-haired slave," they muttered, "born under a cursed star." Women at the market crossed themselves when the topic arose, murmuring prayers beneath their breath. The smell of the place in those days was unforgettable. Hot iron from the blacksmith's forge, sweet rot from fallen peaches near the orchards, sweat drifting from the overseer's yard. The river smelled of clay and slow-moving water. And in the evenings, as lanterns flickered on porches and frogs croaked in the distance, a thin chill would sweep through the lowlands, as though the land itself knew something was wrong. Travelers who passed through the county often remarked on the peculiar tension in the air. One diarist, a schoolteacher from Virginia passing through to visit her sister, wrote about the strange silence she encountered near the Albright land. "The birds quiet at midday," she noted. "Even the insects seem to hold their breath. There is something uneasy here, something watching." No one knew then that the birth of that little girl, Etta, would mark the beginning of a story that would unravel families, expose hidden graves, and challenge the boundaries of both faith and science. But the land felt it. The people felt it. As years turned, and Etta grew, the counties around the Tallapoosa would become a crucible of superstition, sickness, and whispered horrors. But long before the first tragedy struck, before the first disappearance, before the first night the dogs refused to bark, the world around her had already sharpened its attention on the Albright estate. It was a time when the smallest incongruity could spark a fire of rumor, and Etta's hair was more than an incongruity. It was a flame. And as we move deeper into her story, into the humid heart of Alabama in the years before the Civil War, You'll see how a single anomaly in a single birth could ignite questions no one was prepared to answer. The roads that wound between towns in those days were narrow and shaded by towering pines. Wagons rolled slowly, pulled by mules with ribs showing like the lines of a washboard. Travelers often made camp in shallow clearings, building fires with dripping greenwood. Voices carried through the trees, soft murmurs, prayers, arguments over maps. There were tales told by firelight of the strange girl on the Albright property. Men who had never set foot in Alabama repeated the rumor, passing it down state lines as easily as a story about a haunted inn or a murderous highwayman. Because every era has its monsters, every era has its miracles, but only a rare few walk the line between. Etta was one of them. And though the world around her lived in the rhythms of harvest, the crack of overseer whips, the Sunday hymns rising from the white church on the hill, the steady thrum of life concealed a truth too dangerous to acknowledge. The Albright estate was slowly becoming the epicenter of something unholy. Dogs whined at night, not in anger, but in fear. Horses refused to drink from the northern well. Torches blew out during calm weather. Children woke screaming, claiming a woman with shining hair had stood at the foot of their beds. Parents dismissed them, but their voices trembled when they did. Etta was growing, and with each passing year, her presence bent the atmosphere around her like heat rising from a scorched field. This was the world she entered, a world where the color of her hair shaped her fate before she could walk, where people watched her with suspicion, fear, fascination, and where every shadow on the Albright property carried the unspoken question, what was she? They said Etta did not cry much as a toddler, though that should have comforted her caretakers. Instead, it unnerved them. Most children wailed through the nights, colicky and restless, but Etta often sat silently in her crib, a wooden box lined with patched cloth, gazing at the ceiling with eyes too dark and too calm for a child her age. She was small, light-boned, thin as a reed, but her hair was the thing that held every gaze. Even as a baby, it grew quickly, long white strands curling down her neck like threads pulled from a winter storm. Her mother, Ruth, had died shortly after childbirth, and no one ever agreed on exactly how. Some claimed she bled out, others said she collapsed before a drop was spilled, as if her spirit had simply fled. The midwife refused to speak of the birth altogether. Some things the Lord did not mean for us to witness, she muttered whenever pressed. And so Etta grew under the care of the older slave women, who tended to her with a mixture of fear and reluctant affection. They fed her, dressed her, carried her on their hips while sweeping the cabins, yet none ever managed to shake the feeling that something watched them through her. It wasn't that she stared too intensely. It was that she stared through people, as if searching for something behind their faces. By the time she'd learned to walk, Etta had developed a peculiar habit, following light, lanterns, candles, even the glint of metal in the sun. Her eyes tracked brightness with the same hunger a starving child might show a meal. When overseers shouted, she did not flinch. When thunder cracked, she did not run. But if a lantern sputtered, she would stand up straight, head tilted, listening. Why she look at lamps like that? A young field hand once whispered while mending a fence. Old Miriam, who had tended Etta since birth, answered quietly, "Child sees things differently. Maybe sees things we don't want to." Miriam meant it as a warning. But the Albrights, particularly the mistress of the house, saw it as something far more potent. Marietta Albright had been a striking woman once, tall and elegant, the kind whose posture alone commanded attention. But by the time Etta reached 6 years old, Marietta's beauty had curdled into something harder, thinner, sharpened by years of illness and a loneliness she denied fiercely. She drifted through the halls of her home like an apparition made of starch and secrets, her dresses perfectly pressed, her hair always pinned precisely, her face pale beneath layers of powder. Guests who visited the Albright estate often found her unsettling, though they could rarely pinpoint why. She smiled, but it never reached her eyes. She laughed, but only when others were watching, and she had a habit of appearing suddenly in doorways, listening before revealing herself, as though she needed to collect other people's words like a miser hoarding coins. Her relationship with Etta began with revulsion. She refused to let the girl anywhere near the main house. But something shifted the year Marietta suffered a crushing migraine that left her bedridden for 3 days. The plantation doctor claimed it was exhaustion, stress, and perhaps too tight corseting. But Marietta insisted the pain had been unlike any she'd known. "Like pins pushed through my skull," she allegedly whispered. During one of those nights, when the curtains billowed softly and Marietta lay sweating and delirious, she opened her eyes to find Etta standing in the doorway, barefoot, silent, white hair glowing faintly in the moonlight. She did not speak. She simply stared. Marietta later insisted that the pain stopped in that moment. "She drew it out," she hissed at her husband the next morning. "The child took it from me. I felt it leave." Her husband laughed at first, then realized she wasn't joking. From that day on, Marietta watched Etta with a blend of awe, fear, and calculation. She summoned the girl to the porch some afternoons, claiming she wished to observe her manners. Other times she invited Etta to stand in the hall while guests gathered, letting them catch a glimpse of the unusual child, as though showing off a rare artifact. But when the guests were gone, Marietta's gaze hardened. She paced, whispered, stared through windows. Her personal journal, later found hidden behind a brick in the pantry wall, held passages written in frantic loops. "She hears what others do not. She sees what others do not. God forgive me, but I think she was sent here for me." And another entry, darker still. "If I could understand her, perhaps I could be free." Whether she meant free from illness, free from loneliness, or free from a burden she never named, no one could say. The third figure in Etta's orbit was Dr. Horace Dullen, a man whose appearance alone inspired unease. It lay on the wall and gaunt, with narrow shoulders and deep-set eyes glassing perpetually half-shut, as if he lived in a constant study of the world. His hair, combed neatly each morning, always seemed to fall into disarray by afternoon, as though every bit of order he imposed upon himself inevitably slipped. Dullen was not a man of cruelty, nor of kindness. He stood somewhere in the gray middle, led more by curiosity than conscience. The townsfolk respected him, but they also whispered about him, how he collected unusual specimens in jars, how he read European medical journals no one else had even heard of, how he believed the human body could be decoded like a cipher. When Etta was still young, Marietta summoned Dullen frequently to examine her. He would sit her on a stool in the carriage house, windows cracked open just enough to let in a sliver of light, and he would observe. He listened to her heartbeat with a brass stethoscope, measured the length of her limbs, shined a lantern into her eyes to see how the pupils contracted. "Does it hurt when I do this?" he asked once, tapping the side of her throat. Etta shook her head softly. "Can you tell me what you dream about?" She blinked, said nothing. Dullen studied her silence with fascination. Another time, a storm raged outside while Etta sat across from him, a wool blanket wrapped loosely around her shoulders. The wind howled through the gaps in the roof, rattling the beams. "You know," Dullen murmured as he scribbled notes, "most children fear storms." Etta finally spoke, her voice so soft it nearly blended with the rain. "Storms hear things." Dullen froze, the quill in his hand trembling. "What do they hear?" Etta's gaze drifted toward the ceiling, where the rain hammered relentlessly. "Same things I do." That was the first recorded sentence she ever said directly to him. From then on, Dellen became more than the plantation's physician. He became a witness, one who suspected there was something deeper, something not yet charted in any medical text. He struggled between rationality and wonder, trying to ground his thoughts in science, even as the evidence before him tugged him toward the unexplainable. Meanwhile, the slaves who lived around Etta learned to navigate her presence with cautious reverence. They did not shun her. They protected her as best they could, but they feared the reactions she provoked in the White household. Some believed she was a sign from God. Others whispered she was marked by spirits of the woods. A few insisted she had been born under the shadow of a blood moon. But no matter their beliefs, they understood one truth. Proximity to Etta meant proximity to danger. Overseer Thomas Brack, a brutal man with a permanent sneer carved into his face, hated the girl openly. He spat whenever she passed him on the road to the well. "Look at her," he once snarled to a fellow overseer. "White as any of us, but cursed blood all the same." Etta had overheard this. She did not react, not outwardly. But later that night, Brack fell from his horse, claiming something startled the animal. No one saw what happened, but he swore he heard whispering in the dark, soft as breath against his ear. He blamed Etta. Everyone else ignored him. The strange convergence of people around the Albright estate. Marietta with her sharp, hungry eyes, Dr. Dullen with his trembling fascination, the enslaved community torn between fear and protection, created a tension that thickened year after year. And at the center sat Etta, a ghost-white flame in a land of red clay and sweat. One summer evening when Etta was 8, she wandered near the fields where a group of women were shelling peas under a poplar tree. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the ground. Miriam looked up first and beckoned her over. "Come sit, baby," she said. "You keep to yourself too much." Etta sat beside her, folding her legs neatly under her. One of the younger women hesitated before offering her a handful of peas. As Etta reached out, the woman pulled her hand back just slightly, as though touching the girl might change something inside her. She forced herself to extend it again. Etta took the peas, staring at them curiously. "Why you always so quiet?" the woman asked with a nervous smile. Etta shrugged. "People hear too much already." Miriam chuckled wearily. "Child speaks riddles." But her hands did not stop trembling. As night settled and the lanterns lit, the Albright estate grew darker, not in the way of a place simply losing sunlight, but in the way of a place preparing for something. The characters circling Etta did not yet realize how their lives were intertwined, how one child's existence had become a thread pulling tight around all of them. And soon enough, that thread would snap. The first sign came quietly, so quietly that those who witnessed it could barely articulate what they'd seen. It was a summer night thick with crickets, the sky clear enough to show every star over the Tallapoosa hills. Sweat clung to the skin like a second layer, and the cabin smelled of damp wood and warm earth. Everyone slept with their windows cracked, hoping for a breeze that never came. Etta, now nearing her 9th birthday, had begun sleepwalking. Or at least that was the closest word anyone had. The truth felt stranger. Miriam was the first to notice it, waking in the dead of night to find the cabin door ajar and Etta's cot empty. She grabbed a shawl, muttering a prayer under her breath, and stepped out into the yard. The moon cast pale light over the fields, turning the cotton rows silver, and there, standing at the edge of the tree line, was Etta. She did not move, did not sway. Her hair glowed faintly, catching the moonlight like polished bone. "Etta," Miriam whispered, afraid to startle her. "Baby, come on back now." The girl did not turn. Miriam approached slowly, her footsteps sinking into the soft dirt. As she neared, she realized Etta's eyes were open, but the pupils were so wide that the irises disappeared into darkness. Her chest rose and fell with steady breaths, but something about her posture felt wrong, rigid, as though she were listening. "Child," Miriam murmured, gently touching her arm. "You gon' get yourself lost out here." Etta spoke in a voice far too calm for someone asleep. "They're whispering again." Miriam's grip tightened. "Who whispering?" Etta lifted a hand, pointing toward the woods where the shadows lay thick as oil. "The ones under the ground." A cold wind surged through the fields, though the air had been still moments before. Miriam pulled the girl to her chest and hurried back toward the cabin. She did not tell the overseers. She did not tell the other women. She only told one person, the root worker who lived by the creek. 3 days later, the root worker left the county without warning. But the sleepwalking did not stop. The second sign came from the animals. The plantation dogs, trained to patrol the property, began refusing to leave their kennels at night. They whined, scratched at the wooden sides, and one even chewed through its own tether in a desperate attempt to burrow under the straw. The overseer blamed sickness, but none showed symptoms. They weren't ill. They were afraid. One night, Overseer Brack tried to drag one of the hounds out by the collar. "Come on, you useless beast," he snarled, yanking until the dog yelped. Etta had been walking back from the well with a pail when she saw him. She stopped, watching the struggle. Brack turned on her. "What are you staring at?" Etta blinked once. "He hears what you don't." "And what's that supposed to mean?" Brack barked. She tilted her head, listening to something only she could hear. "The ground is loud tonight." Brack let go of the dog as though burned. He stumbled back, cursed under his breath, and refused to go near the kennels for the rest of the evening. The following morning, the hound he'd tried to force out was found dead. No injuries, no struggle, simply dead, as if fear alone had stopped its heart. The third sign touched the Albright household directly. Marietta Albright began experiencing nightmares, violent ones. Servants reported hearing her shriek late in the night, clawing at her bedclothes, insisting that something had been sitting on her chest, pressing the breath from her lungs. Her husband ordered Dullen to examine her, but the doctor found no physical cause. Marietta refused to sleep in her bedroom after that. She moved to the parlor, insisting the air in the house felt wrong. During one of her episodes, while 2 servants held her down to keep her from injuring herself, Marietta screamed a name that froze the blood of everyone present. "Etta!" She screamed it over and over until her voice cracked. When the fit ended, she wept silently, trembling as though chilled to the bone despite the summer heat. Dullen arrived shortly after and pulled her aside. "Why did you call the girl's name?" he asked gently. Marietta wiped her eyes, her hands shaking. "Because she was in the dream." "What did she do?" Marietta swallowed, unable to meet his gaze. "She stood there, at the foot of my bed, and the room grew so cold I could see my breath." She paused. "Her eyes were wrong." Dullen considered this, his scientific mind fighting with something deeper, something instinctual. "And you're certain it wasn't simply fear?" Marietta looked him dead in the eye. "She smiled at me, Horace. Children do not smile like that." Yet, no matter how loudly Marietta protested, her husband dismissed the dreams as hysteria, brought on by heat and stress and imagination. He had no patience for superstition. But superstition has patience for everyone. The final early sign, the one the town would later whisper about for decades, occurred on a morning that should have been ordinary. A field hand named Quincy was clearing brush near the north well when he struck something solid beneath the soil. He expected a root or a stone. Instead, he uncovered a small wooden box, its surface rotted, its edges softened by time. He pried it open. Inside lay a set of infant footprints pressed into hardened clay. On, and above them, etched into a thin piece of metal that had darkened with age, was a date, the year Etta was born. Quincy closed the lid slowly, as though afraid the box might bite. When he turned, Etta was standing behind him. "How long was it there?" he asked her quietly, unable to hide the tremor in his voice. Etta looked at the box, then at him. "It wasn't buried," she said. Quincy frowned. "What do you mean it wasn't buried? I just pulled it out the dirt." It was waiting. Before he could speak, she walked away, leaving him alone with the box and the unsettling certainty that she had told the truth. From that point on, the plantation seemed to hold its breath. The land grew heavier, the nights deeper, the silences longer. And though no one yet understood what was coming, everyone felt it. Because darkness rarely arrives all at once. It begins quietly. Footsteps in the night, animals refusing to go near certain places, children speaking truths they shouldn't know. And on the Albright estate, every early sign pointed toward one thing. Something had awakened. Fear does not arrive as a shout. It settles in as a whisper, low, persistent, testing the corners of one's mind until even the most rational man begins to doubt the solidity of daylight. That summer on the Albright estate, the whispers grew louder, the rumors thickened, and suspicion, once a barely visible thread, began to stitch itself into the fabric of everyday life. The first public crack appeared during Sunday service. The church perched on a low hill overlooking the town square, its white paint blistered by the heat, its steeple slightly crooked from years of storms. The building smelled of old hymnals, damp wood, and the faintly metallic tang of the kerosene lamps that lined the walls. Men sat on one side, women on the other. Children fidgeted between them. The enslaved were confined to the balcony, where heat climbed and collected like a living thing. On that particular Sunday, Reverend Cartwright, a thin, severe man with a voice that sliced rather than soothed, chose to preach on the dangers of unnatural births. His words rolled down the pew-lined aisle like a crackling fire. "There are children," he thundered, raising one bony hand toward the rafters, "born not from God's grace, but from his wrath. Mark my words. When the Lord permits something outside his natural order, it is not for us to admire, but to fear." People shifted uncomfortably. A few in the congregation stared downward at their boots, hands clenched. Etta Albright, sitting bolt upright in the front pew, did not blink. She stared straight ahead, eyes glassy, lips held tight. Up in the balcony, Miriam placed a hand over Etta's, squeezing gently as the girl sat beside her. Etta's posture remained relaxed, but Miriam felt her pulse quicken. Reverend Cartwright paced slowly, his boots thumping against the wooden floorboards. Creatures born with strange markings, with pale eyes, with colors no child should possess. "These are signs." His voice rose, trembling with fervor. "And if a community ignores such omens, we invite suffering of the gravest kind." Though he never said her name, every head in the church felt as though it had turned toward Etta without moving. A murmur fluttered through the congregation like startled birds. Reverend Cartwright paused, letting the silence fill the room. Then he continued in a quieter tone, more dangerous for its restraint. "God's world does not make mistakes, but sometimes men and women do, and sometimes he allows the sign of that mistake to be born among us." Up in the balcony, Etta finally turned her head and looked down toward the pulpit. Her dark eyes locked onto the preacher's. He faltered. only for a heartbeat, but long enough that the breath of everyone in the church seemed to stop. After service ended, the town square buzzed like a disturbed hive. People lingered in clusters, fanning themselves with folded paper, whispering behind gloved hands. A few kept glancing toward the Albright carriage, where Marietta waited stiffly for her husband. One woman asked another, "Did you hear him? Unnatural births. He's speaking plain as daylight." Her companion nodded, lowering her voice. "And we all know why." Meanwhile, in the balcony stairwell, Miriam ushered Etta down as quickly as she could. "We gon' go home," she murmured, "and we ain't gon' think about what that man said." Etta's gaze lingered on the church behind them. "He's afraid." "Of what?" "He doesn't know," Etta said simply. "People fear what they don't hear." "Hear?" Miriam repeated, confused. But Etta only continued walking. The tension grew further when a local boy, 12-year-old Caleb Hargrove, went missing. His disappearance rocked the county. He had been helping his father repair a boundary fence near the forest line when dusk settled in. The father turned away only for a moment, he claimed. When he looked again, Caleb was gone. No shout, no rustle of brush, no sign of struggle. Just gone. And the search began immediately. Men spread across the property with lanterns and rifles. Women prayed in small circles, clutching each other's hands. Dogs were brought out to track his scent, but the hounds refused to approach the woods. They tucked their tails, whined, backed away until they trembled violently. One of the men grew frustrated and slapped a dog across the muzzle. "Useless mutts," he spat. "A child is out there." But the dogs only cried louder. Dr. Dullen arrived to assist, having been summoned by one of the Hargroves. He tethered his horse and listened as men argued about where to search next. "It's the girl," one of them muttered, loud enough that several others turned. "Things been wrong since she came along." Dullen approached him. "You're suggesting a 9-year-old child abducted a boy twice her size?" The man swallowed. "I'm suggesting what everyone's thinking." "No," Dullen corrected, voice cool and precise. "You're suggesting what fear is thinking. They are not the same." But reason was a thin thread against a thickening storm of superstition. That evening, as the search continued, Dullen found himself drawn toward the tree line, not by a hunch, but by a sound, soft, rhythmic, almost like humming. He followed it carefully, brushing branches aside, listening as the hum grew louder. It led him to a clearing he didn't recognize, one he was certain had not been there in years past. The air felt colder, though the night was warm. Fireflies drifted low to the ground, their lights pulsing in a strange synchronization. And in the center stood Etta. Her back was to him. Her hair shimmered under the moonlight. Dullen called out gently, "Etta." She didn't turn. The humming stopped. "Etta," he said again, stepping forward cautiously. "You shouldn't be out here alone. There's a search underway. A child is missing." She spoke quietly. "I know." "How do you know?" he asked. Etta pointed downward at the earth. "He's not here." Dullen frowned, suddenly aware of how still the woods had become. "Where is he, then?" Etta lowered her arm and whispered, "With the ones who listen." The doctor's mouth went dry. "Who listens?" She turned then, slowly, and looked up at him with eyes as dark as river mud. "The ground." Before Dullen could respond, a shout cut through the air. "Doctor!" He turned sharply. Men pushed through the trees, lanterns raised, faces anxious. "We found tracks near the river," one yelled. "We need you." When he looked back at the clearing, Etta was gone. She had vanished silently into the shadows, so completely that Dullen wondered, briefly, dangerously, whether she had ever been there. The search ended at midnight. Caleb Hargrove's body was found near the riverbank, curled under the roots of a fallen tree. He had not been attacked. No bruises, no wounds, no signs of drowning. His face was peaceful, eyes closed, like a child asleep. But his right hand was clenched tightly around a small object. When they pried his fingers open, they found a single strand of white hair. Whispers roared through the crowd. Men stepped back. Women gasped and crossed themselves. Etta was not there, but in that moment, her presence filled the riverbank more powerfully than if she had stood among them. Word spread with merciless speed. Within 24 hours, the entire county believed Etta had something to do with Caleb's death. Some claimed she had lured him. Others insisted she had cursed him. A few said she had summoned something from the woods. Marietta was the first to speak publicly in Etta's defense. "My God," she snapped at a visitor who insinuated Etta's guilt. "She's a child. A strange child, yes, but children do not summon death." The man muttered, "Some do." Marietta's face flushed with fury. "You will not bring your witch stories into my home." Yet even she, in the privacy of her room, clutched her rosary with white knuckles. Dullen tried to restore order by hosting an official inquiry at the Albright house. The dining room table was cleared, replaced with a large ledger and several chairs. Men crowded the room, sweat staining their collars, suspicion sharpening their voices. "I want statements," Dullen said firmly. "Facts, not rumors." But rumors were all most had to offer. "I heard she was in the woods that night," one said. "I heard she talked to shadows," said another. Dullen slammed his fist on the table. You heard. I want what you saw." Silence followed. Finally, Quincy, the same man who had found the strange baby footprint box months earlier, spoke. "I saw her," he said reluctantly. "But she didn't do nothing. She just stood there, looking, listening." "Listening to what?" Dullen asked. Quincy hesitated, then murmured, "The ground." The room went still. Men exchanged unsettled glances. From the back, an older man whispered, "Lord have mercy." Dullen inhaled slowly. "You all know superstition does not make truth. Children talk to themselves. Children wonder. It does not mean they bring death." But even as he spoke, his voice trembled at the edges. Because he remembered the clearing, the humming, the cold, and, worst of all, he remembered Etta's words. "He's not here. He's with the ones who listen." Despite Dullen's efforts, suspicion tightened its grip like a noose. The slaves were ordered not to let Etta out after dark. Miriam nearly begged the overseer for leniency, but he shook his head. "Orders from the top," he grunted. "People don't feel safe." "Safe from a child?" she snapped. He glared. "Safe from whatever follows her." One evening, Marietta summoned Dullen to her private parlor, a small, dim room lined with books and the scent of lavender oil. She paced in front of the window, hands clasped tightly behind her back. "She's in danger," Marietta said without turning. "I can feel it." Dullen folded his arms. "Every soul on this property feels danger right now." "No, you don't understand." She turned then, her eyes wild with something between fear and certainty. "Someone is going to hurt her." "Who?" Marietta hesitated. "Everyone." Dullen softened. "Marietta, she needs protection, yes, but she also needs understanding." "Understanding?" she echoed sharply. "Horace, for God's sake, do you understand her?" He looked down, unable to lie. "Not fully." Marietta laughed bitterly. "Then what chance do the rest of them have?" Outside, dusk had fallen, a thick, heavy dusk that seemed to press against the windows like a living thing. "What do you think?" Marietta asked suddenly, her voice dropping to a whisper. Is she cursed or chosen? Dullen did not answer immediately. Instead, he asked her quietly, "What do you believe?" Marietta stared toward the darkening yard. "I think she is the hinge between what we fear and what we refuse to see." "And what is that?" Marietta closed her eyes. "The truth." The nights that followed grew stranger. Lights flickered for no reason. The air carried distant sounds like buried whispers rising through the soil. More animals fell ill. A servant claimed she heard knocking beneath the floorboards. Another said she saw a figure standing at the edge of her bed, hair white as milk, yet when she lit her candle, the room was empty. And slowly, inevitably, suspicion twisted into something deeper. Paranoia. Men locked their doors. Women slept with Bibles beneath their pillows. Children refused to fetch water from the north well after dark. And Etta, quiet, pale, listening Etta, became the center of it all. "What do you think?" people whispered to each other. "Guilty souls cursed by God or victims of madness? Tell us below. Your theories matter here." Because something was stirring beneath the Albright estate, and the ground was beginning to speak louder. Suspicion might have remained mere superstition, something that smoldered quietly in private conversations, if not for what happened in early autumn, when the air cooled just enough to sharpen every sound. The leaves had not yet changed color, but the wind had taken on a metallic crispness, smelling faintly of rain and iron and something else that no one could name. It was on such a morning that a scream tore across the yard. It came from the smokehouse where two enslaved women, Clara and Mercy, were preparing salted pork. The scream was so piercing that even the overseers dropped what they were doing. Men and women rushed toward the source, boots thudding across dry earth, hearts pounding. Clara stumbled out first, pale as chalk, her hands shaking violently. Mercy followed, clutching her apron to her face, tears streaming down her cheeks. "What's wrong?" someone shouted. "Lord above, what did you see?" Mercy pointed a trembling finger toward the smokehouse. It was moving." What was? The shadows. At first, the men assumed she meant an intruder, maybe an animal. They grabbed lanterns and pushed inside, prepared for anything solid, anything explainable. But there was nothing. The smokehouse was empty, silent. Only hook chains swayed gently, though no wind had entered, and the air felt oddly cold. When Clara finally caught her breath, she whispered the part that planted fear deeper into the ground. "We heard singin'," she said softly. A child's voice, hummin'. Someone muttered, "How a child get in there?" Clara stared at him, her voice breaking. There weren't no child. That night, an emergency meeting formed in the Albright dining room. Candles flickered erratically, casting long shadows across the walls. Men wiped sweat from their necks despite the cool air. Women twisted handkerchiefs in their fists. Marietta stood at the head of the table, her composure brittle. "This house will not succumb to hysteria," she declared. "Whatever Clara and Mercy saw—" "What they heard," someone corrected. Marietta's jaw tightened. "Whatever they experienced, it does not justify wild accusations." But the very protest sharpened the room's doubt. A farmer named Braxton Peters leaned forward. He was a broad man with a voice that carried the confidence of someone who considered his own beliefs fact. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "all these strange goings-on started with that girl. The animals, the boy, the sleepwalking, the cold spots. Folk ain't blind." Marietta lifted her chin. "Folk should look to their own sins before blaming a child." Braxton slammed his fist on the table. "A child who doesn't bleed properly." The room froze. Marietta's eyes narrowed dangerously. What did you just say? Braxton looked around for support before continuing. My cousin works the infirmary. Says when the girl scraped her knee, the blood came out dark as pitch, near black, didn't run, thick as syrup. A collective shudder rippled through the group. Dullen stood abruptly, knocking over his quill. That is exaggeration. Blood viscosity can vary. Shadows distort color. You're all listening to gossip. But even he heard the thinness in his own voice. Braxton stared at him. Doctor, you seen that girl more than anyone. You telling us she's natural? Dullen hesitated. A single moment, barely a breath. But in that pause, every man and woman in the room seemed to lean forward. Marietta stepped between them. Enough. This meeting is over. But ending the meeting did nothing to stop the wildfire. It only split it into smaller flames. People began watching Etta in the daylight. Not openly, but with sideways glances, their eyes flickering to her whenever she walked past the well or carried wash water. Conversations hushed when she approached. Children who once played near her now stepped away quietly, as though drawn by instinct more than upbringing. Even the enslaved, those who loved her in their own guarded way, felt the tremor of fear beneath their ribs. They whispered among themselves at night by the glow of dying embers. She different, but she ours, Miriam insisted. We protect our own. But protecting her might mean we in danger, another woman said softly. Miriam glared. Child was born in pain. That don't make her evil. The woman shifted uneasily. Maybe pain changed her. A series of thefts in the plantation household only deepened suspicion. Small items at first. A silver spoon, a brooch, a spool of thread, went missing. The house servants were interrogated harshly. But when a pair of delicate mother-of-pearl earrings disappeared, the accusation fell squarely, unfairly, upon Etta. It happened during supper. Marietta was at the head of the table, guests chattering around her. Her hand drifted to her ear, and froze. The earrings were gone. She stood abruptly, causing her chair to scrape loudly against the floor. Search the house, she commanded. Now. The servants scattered. Dullen approached her calmly. Marietta, perhaps you misplaced. I did not, she snapped. Someone took them. 2 hours later, the earrings were found outside, laying neatly on the threshold of the north well. The cursed well, someone muttered, where that boy was found. The murmurs began immediately. Who puts jewelry out by a well? It's a message. She wants attention. She wants fear. Marietta's face turned ghost white. She? Dullen repeated, frowning. You mean the girl? Marietta shook her head mechanically. Etta didn't do this. But she sounded more like she was trying to convince herself than the others. The next escalation came from the slaves' quarters. One night, a woman named Agnes woke screaming, claiming she had seen a figure standing above her, long white hair floating as though underwater. Several others rushed in, lighting candles and lanterns, searching the room. Nothing was there. Agnes clutched Miriam's sleeve. I saw her. She was hovering. Child don't float, Miriam said firmly. I tellin' you, she weren't touching the ground. The rumor spread with merciless speed. Men began carrying good luck charms. Women hung herbs over their doors. Children were told not to talk about Etta unless absolutely necessary. Even the bravest grew uneasy when she walked by, for she moved with a quietness that felt too absolute, too complete. The town judge, a stern man with deep furrows in his brow, came to question the Albrights privately. We cannot have unrest, he warned. Not now. Unrest? Marietta echoed. You think a child is causing unrest? I think, the judge said carefully, that people believe what they fear. And what do you believe? She asked. The judge hesitated. "I believe something unnatural is happening on this property." Marietta slapped him. The sound cracked through the parlor like a shot. The judge's face reddened, but he did not retaliate. Instead, he stepped back, nodded stiffly, and left without another word. That night, Marietta sat in the dim glow of a single candle, staring at her hands. Dillon found her there hours later. "You're unraveling," he said quietly. She looked up at him with hollow eyes. "So is the world." "Marietta, tell me the truth." She swallowed. "I don't know the truth anymore." Dillon knelt beside her chair. "Then let me find it." She gripped his sleeve. "What if the truth is worse than the rumors?" Before he could answer, a crash sounded outside, a wooden bucket tipping over near the porch. They hurried to the window. Etta stood in the yard, barefoot, still, staring at the house. Her hair drifted slightly, though there was no wind. "What is she doing?" Marietta whispered. Dillon's voice was barely audible. "Listening." For what? Neither could guess. The final event that cemented true paranoia came less than a week later. It was a moonless night. Clouds blotted out the stars. The darkness felt thick, almost tangible, as though it were a substance filling the air rather than an absence of light. At the far edge of the field, near the old cotton gin, a lantern flickered. Two field hands approached it cautiously. "Who left a lantern burning out here?" one asked. "Maybe overseer," the other replied. But as they drew closer, they saw something that chilled them to their bones. The lantern was hanging from a wooden stake, and beneath it, circling in the dirt, were handprints, small ones, child-sized, pressed deep into the earth, forming a perfect ring. Dozens of them, as if a child had walked in an unbroken circle with hands dragging along the ground. Except the prints were too uniform, too deliberate, too precise. One of the men whispered, "Lord have mercy." The other whispered, "Get the doctor." By dawn, the entire plantation knew. Every household in the county had heard by noon. By nightfall, no one trusted Etta's shadow. Suspicion had hardened into full terror. And the terror was beginning to grow teeth. When horror finally revealed its face on the Albright estate, it did not arrive with screams. It arrived with silence, deep, unbroken, suffocating silence, the kind that feels like the world holding its breath before something unspeakable emerges. It was late October when the stillness settled over the fields. The harvest was nearly over. The cotton had been picked clean, the bales stacked like pale tombs near the road. The days were cooling, the nights sharpening, and a grayness had seeped into the land as though every tree had begun to exhale its secrets into the air. And Etta, now nearly 10, walked the estate as though she sensed the shift long before anyone else. She stood at the edge of the corn crib one morning, watching crows circle overhead in spirals, tight and controlled, as if bound by an invisible center point. Miriam called her in for breakfast, but Etta didn't move, not even when Miriam touched her shoulder. "What you looking at, child?" Miriam asked. Etta lifted a finger and traced the bird's spirals in the air. "They're waiting." "For what?" "For the ground to finish speaking." Miriam's skin prickled, but she forced herself to laugh gently. "Now what kind of talk is that? Land don't speak." Etta turned to her, eyes dark and reflective. "It does. People just forget how to hear it." Those words would haunt Miriam for the rest of her life. Later that afternoon, a strange tremor rippled through the property. Not an earthquake, just a brief, subtle vibration beneath the soil, like something turning in its sleep far below. The older men felt it in their boots and paused mid-step. The animals reacted instantly. Horses reared, chickens scattered into the brush. Even the mules pressed against their stalls with wide, panicked eyes. But nothing frightened the overseers more than what happened next. The north well, the cursed well, began to bleed. It started as a thin line of dark liquid trickling from the stones, then swelled into a slow seep that dripped down into the dirt. The ground absorbed it greedily. When the men leaned close with lanterns, expecting rust or paint or mud, they recoiled violently. The liquid was thick, viscous, red. Blood, someone whispered. No, another argued hoarsely. That ain't blood. Ain't any blood I ever seen. Because it wasn't the bright red of fresh wounds. It was darker, nearly black, like the residue of something aged and hidden too long. Before anyone could speak again, a voice rose behind them. It's waking. They turned. Etta stood barefoot near the well, her white hair drifting around her face in the cool wind. The men stepped back immediately, some clutching their crucifixes, others reaching instinctively for tools that could serve as weapons. Miriam hurried to her, breathless. Etta, don't be coming near this place. Child, get away from there. But Etta didn't move. Her gaze remained fixed on the stones, on the seepage. She knelt slowly and pressed her palm to the wet earth. Stop that, one of the overseers barked. Don't touch it. But Etta whispered, It's not for me. And then she stood and walked away calmly, leaving Miriam trembling and the overseers staring after her with wide, fearful eyes. News of the bleeding well spread instantly. Men armed themselves. Women kept their children indoors. The Reverend called an emergency gathering at the church, urging everyone to fortify their hearts and minds against the devil's work. But the devil they feared was a child. Etta Albright, exhausted by weeks of unrest, demanded Dullen come to the house. I won't live in fear, she declared, pacing the length of her parlor. This is my home, my family's land. I will not have it turned into a theater of superstition. Dullen watched her nervously. Marietta, something is happening. Whether natural or not, it's affecting everyone. She turned sharply. Do you believe she's the cause? Dullen hesitated. I believe she's connected. Marietta sank into her chair, covering her face briefly with one trembling hand. Horace, she isn't evil. No, Dullen agreed. But people who are afraid will not care about that distinction. Their conversation was interrupted by a frantic pounding on the front door. A servant burst inside without waiting for permission. Ma'am, the men, they want the girl brought out. They say they gon' drag her to the church, make the Reverend look her over proper and decide if she cursed. Marietta stood so fast her chair toppled. Absolutely not. But outside, a crowd was forming. Lanterns, torches, men with tightened jaws, women with prayer books clutched to their chests. The air buzzed with heat and anger. Bring the girl, someone shouted. We got a right to know. She cursed that well. And that boy. She's bringing darkness on all of us. Miriam stepped in front of Etta's cabin door, arms spread wide. Ain't no one taking this child. Step aside, woman, a man growled. You step near her and the Lord himself gon' strike you down, Miriam spat. A murmur of fear fluttered through the crowd, but it wasn't enough to stop them. They surged forward. Marietta stormed out of the house, climbing onto the porch with the authority of every generation of Albrights behind her. You will not touch that girl, she shouted. Braxton Peters pointed at her. With respect, ma'am, you ain't protecting your home. You hiding a curse. Marietta's voice cracked like a whip. The only curse here is your ignorance. The crowd roared in anger. At that moment, Dullen arrived on horseback, breathless, coat flapping behind him. He dismounted and shoved through the crowd, raising both hands. Everyone calm yourselves, he commanded. You're letting fear cloud reason. Reason, someone spat. You seen what's been happening, Doctor? Dullen tried again. She is a child. A strange one, yes, but a child all the same. Let me speak with her. Let me examine her. I can determine what's... A scream split the night. Every head turned. Etta stood in the center of the yard. Her hair lifted around her as if under water. Her eyes were focused on something no one could see. Her small chest rose and fell quickly, like she was struggling to breathe. Miriam rushed toward her. Baby, what's wrong? Etta's lips parted. They're waking the ones beneath. Dullen stepped forward. Etta, listen to me. Who is waking? She didn't blink, didn't look at him. Her voice sounded distant, hollow. The ones who listen, the ones the ground holds tight. The torches flickered violently, though no wind blew. A deep rumble, soft but unmistakable, vibrated through the earth. Women clutched their children. Men stepped back. Dullen felt the hair rise on his arms. What is beneath the ground? He whispered. Etta turned her head slowly, and for the first time since she was born, she looked afraid. They are not alive. The rumble deepened. Someone shouted, Get her away from the well. Another yelled, She's summoning them. The crowd surged toward her again, more desperate this time, more frenzied. But before anyone reached the child, Marietta sprinted forward and threw her arms around Etta protectively. No, she screamed. No one touches her. Braxton Peters stepped forward, face twisted with anger and terror. Move aside, ma'am, or God help me, we will move you. Marietta straightened, eyes blazing. You will not lay a hand on her. The ground beneath them trembled again, stronger this time. Dust rose in small clouds. The cattle in the distance bellowed wildly. The dogs broke into panicked howls. A woman shrieked, pointing toward the dark line of trees. At first no one saw anything. Then they heard it. A low, rhythmic thudding. Like footsteps. Many footsteps. But underground. The earth pulsed. The crowd froze. Etta whispered, They're coming. Dullen felt his blood turn to ice. Etta, who? The ones who were buried wrong, she murmured. The ones who weren't supposed to sleep. Braxton raised his torch higher, his voice cracking. This is the devil's work. Dullen grabbed his arm. Don't you dare. Braxton shoved him off and lunged toward Etta with the torch. Marietta threw herself in front of the flame, shrieking. Before the torch touched her, the ground exploded. The blast was not fire or smoke, just a violent upheaval of soil as though something enormous had punched upward from below. The crowd screamed, stumbling backward as clods of earth rained down. Dust billowed everywhere, choking the air. From the crater at the center of the yard, a single sound rose a cry. High, piercing, infant-like. But wrong, horribly wrong. Marietta collapsed, clutching Etta. The child clung to her tightly, burying her face in Marietta's dress. Make it stop, Etta sobbed. Please, make it stop. Dullen rushed to them, but the ground shook violently again, and he staggered. From the crater, something began to push upward. Not a hand, not a body, but a bundle of cloth. Small, wrapped tightly, and moving. The crowd scattered in terror. Lord, save us! Kill it! Burn whatever that is! Dullen forced himself closer, fighting against every instinct screaming at him to flee. The bundle twitched. A whimper came from within. He knelt, his hands trembling, and reached out. Doctor! Miriam screamed. Don't touch it! He ignored her. With a shaking breath, he pulled the cloth back. Inside was a clay tablet, pressed with the footprints of an infant, exactly like the one Quincy had unearthed months earlier. And beneath it, carved into the clay in jagged, frantic letters, "She is the key." Braxton dropped his torch. "Oh God Almighty!" Women fainted. Men stumbled away, trying to outrun panic that clung to them like a fever. Dullen stared at the tablet, his vision blurring, his rational mind fracturing around a single truth. Whatever was happening beneath this land had been set in motion the day Etta was born. And the land was done waiting. The ground rumbled again, longer this time, deeper, as though something massive was beginning to turn. Etta cried softly, clutching Marietta. Marietta held her close, whispering, "I won't let them take you, I swear it." But the night had shifted. The earth had awakened. And whatever lay beneath the Albright estate was not finished. If you stood in that room, would you call it crime or sacrifice? Leave your answer. By dawn, the Albright estate was half burned, half collapsed, and wholly unrecognizable. Smoke curled through the air like black veils, carrying with it the scent of charred pine, scorched cotton, and the heavy, unmistakable odor of unearthed soil. The last flame sputtered in the ruins like dying breaths. Men who'd roared with righteous fury hours earlier now stood in stunned silence, watching the remnants of the house smolder. The bravado had drained from their faces. What replaced it was something quieter and far more unsettling. Fear. Not of the child they had hunted, but of what had answered in her place. The bodies came first, those taken by the collapse. 2 men had fallen through the upper floor when the structure gave way. One had been found with his chest crushed beneath a beam. The other lay twisted beside the porch, neck broken, eyes wide in a final expression of absolute terror. But the bodies found beneath the ruined boards were the ones that silenced even the loudest among them. Small bones, tiny ribs, skull fragments the size of marbles. The sheriff trembled as he lifted one piece into the light. "Infants," he whispered. "Lord Almighty." Dullen stepped forward, voice raw. "These aren't recent." The sheriff stared at him. "Then how?" Dullen didn't answer. He couldn't. No explanation fit neatly inside the mind of a sane man. Newspapers from Montgomery and Birmingham descended on the property within 3 days. They scribbled furiously in their notebooks, interviewing survivors, inspecting the scorched grounds, documenting every fragmented account. Headlines appeared within a week. "Ghost child at center of tragedy?" "Strange phenomena follow mass panic in rural Alabama." "Unexplained burials discovered after plantation fire." But the papers printed only fragments of truth. Not the knocking beneath the floorboards. Not the infant-like cries rising from the earth. Not the white-haired girl who seemed to hear voices no one else could. Those details lived only in the whispered testimonies of those who had been there, and even those people, when questioned directly, often fell silent, their eyes drifting toward the ground as though remembering that the ground listened. The reverend who had led the mob was the first to shift his story. He told reporters that the fire was an accident, that hysteria had overcome the townsfolk, that no supernatural forces had been present. But at night, he locked his doors, refused to step outside after dusk, and slept with a Bible on his chest. His wife later confided to a friend that he woke screaming for weeks. Dreams of walls splitting open, of tiny hands clawing through soil, of a child's voice whispering his name from under the church floor. Etta Albright survived the night, but her husband did not. His body was discovered at the edge of the woods, skull split open on the rock as though he had tripped fleeing from something in the dark. The coroner listed it as an accident. No one believed it. Marietta refused to answer questions from officials, reporters, or neighbors. She barricaded herself inside the small house behind the church where sympathetic women brought her meals. She kept Etta close, rarely letting the girl out of arm's reach. When anyone asked what she believed had truly happened on her estate, Marietta would only say, "The land remembered what men tried to forget." Dullen remained in the county, though he was never the same. His medical journals, recovered years later after his death, contained pages of frantic handwriting, diagrams of infant bones, maps of the plantation grounds, notes about underground chambers that had never been recorded on any deed, and at the bottom of one page, smeared with dirt, "She hears them because she belongs to none of us." Rumors spread that he visited the ruins often, even after the state ordered the land condemned. Neighbors spotted him at twilight, kneeling in the ash, pressing his ear to the ground. When asked why, he gave the same unsettling answer: "Because they still move." The black community that had once lived in the slave quarters dispersed rapidly after the tragedy. Families left with only the clothes they carried, unwilling to remain on soil that had betrayed them. Miriam was the only one who stayed long enough to help Marietta gather what remained of her household records. When a reporter asked her if she feared the white-haired child, Miriam scowled and said, "I fear folks who don't listen to sense. That baby ain't evil, but she was born to a world that don't know how to treat her right." Still, she didn't deny the strangeness of the land. "I seen things," she whispered once, "things I pray I forget." The town itself bore the scars for generations. Property lines shifted as people refused to purchase land near the old estate. Children whispered ghost stories about the girl with winter hair and the infants buried beneath their cotton fields. Hunters avoided the woods behind the ruins, claiming their dogs refused to enter. Years later, maps showed the area still marked as dangerous terrain or unstable ground. Scientists blamed a system of underground caverns and unstable clay. Local historians suggested the Albrights might have hidden past crimes, unrecorded burials of unwanted infants, the darkest legacy of slavery itself. But the people who had been there, the ones who felt the earth tremble, who heard the cries from below, knew the official explanations were only half-truths. The ground had offered its own testimony, and those who heard it never forgot the sound. As for Etta, her fate dissolved over time into rumor. Some said Marietta fled with her to New Orleans. Others claimed the girl died in the fever epidemic the following spring. A few believed the government took her, whisked her away to be studied in some hidden laboratory. But the oldest rumor, the one whispered by the last of the enslaved who had lived on the Albright estate, said none of those things. They said Etta grew into a quiet woman who wandered the South anonymously, never staying long. They said her hair turned silver white, and her eyes grew darker with every passing year. They said she could still hear the ground when it murmured. And sometimes, in the dead of night, she would stop walking, tilt her head, and whisper back. The world forgot the Albright estate. The fields reclaimed the ruins. New generations built towns and farms nearby. But when the wind blows across the hollow where the house once stood, locals swear the earth still carries a faint, rhythmic knocking, soft as a heartbeat. And if you listen closely, it sounds like tiny hands. Asking to be remembered. History is a careful listener. It waits in the corners of forgotten fields, beneath abandoned houses, inside the cracks of old stories that no one dares to revisit. And some stories, like the one of the white-haired girl and the restless ground beneath the Albright estate, never truly end. They linger, changing shape as they pass from witness to witness, warning to warning. Perhaps Etta survived. Perhaps she vanished into the folds of America's shadowland. Or perhaps she is still out there, listening to what the rest of us cannot hear. So what do you believe happened on that haunted patch of Alabama soil? Were the events the product of buried sins long denied, or something older, something the earth itself finally refused to keep hidden? Write your theory in the comments. And if you want us to keep digging into America's darkest forgotten histories, like this video and subscribe so you'll be here for next week's story.